In the quiet town where life moved slowly, where the streets whispered with the rustling of leaves and the occasional hum of passing cars. A small stray puppy wandered alone. His tiny paws padded against the cold pavement, his ribs pressing through thin skin, hunger gnawing at his frail body. He had no name, no home, and no one to care if he lived or died. His days were spent scavenging for scraps. His nights curled up in the shadowed corners of alleys, seeking warmth against the unforgiving chill. He had once known kindness, perhaps in the distant memory of a warm place. The scent of a mother he could no longer recall. But that was gone, and the world had proven itself to be a cruel and indifferent place. People passed him by, some casting pitying glances, others shooing him away as if his existence were an inconvenience. And yet, he kept moving, driven by the simple, stubborn will to survive. On this particular day, the puppy's nose twitched as he followed the scent of something edible. A discarded sandwich lay forgotten near the entrance of a convenience store. Just as he was about to dart forward, a group of teenagers emerged. Their laughter sharp and cruel. Their eyes gleamed with mischief. Their hands clutching cans of spray paint. One of them noticed the puppy, and a sinister grin spread across his face. "Hey, look at this little guy," he said, nudging his friend. "Let's give him a makeover." Before the puppy could react, hands grabbed him roughly. He yelped, struggling against the iron grip. But it was no use. He felt the cold spray of paint hit his fur, the acrid fumes burning his nose. Blue, red, yellow, bright, garish colors covered his small body as the boys laughed, delighting in his helplessness. The paint was thick and suffocating, clinging to his fur like a second skin. It seeped into his eyes, stinging and blinding him momentarily. He whimpered, his tiny body trembling as they continued their cruel game. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The teenagers, bored with their amusement, dropped him carelessly onto the pavement and walked away. Still laughing, the puppy lay there for a moment, stunned, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. He was terrified, confused. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the thick, sticky paint. His paws, once a soft brown, were now slick and clumsy, the chemicals burning against his sensitive skin. He tried to lick himself clean, but the taste was bitter and foul, making his stomach churn. Panic set in, and he forced himself to his feet, stumbling into the nearest alleyway. The darkness swallowed him whole, offering a temporary refuge from the cruel world outside. He pressed himself against the cold brick wall, his body heaving with silent sobs. The paint was drying now, tightening around him like a cruel embrace. It cracked with every movement, tugging painfully at his fur. He was miserable, alone, and in that moment, he wished he could disappear. Hours passed, and the town settled into the hush of night. The puppy remained curled in his hiding spot, too weak to move, too frightened to try. His stomach ached with hunger, but the thought of venturing back out into the open, of encountering more cruelty, was unbearable. But then, a sound. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, not the heavy, careless steps of those who sought to harm. A shadow stretched across the alley. Growing closer, the puppy tensed, his body coiling in fear, preparing for the worst. A voice, gentle, warm, "Oh, sweetheart, what happened to you?" The puppy flinched but did not run. He was too tired, too broken. He barely reacted as hands reached for him, lifting him with a tenderness he had never known. The scent of something familiar, something safe, filled his nostrils. Vanilla, soap, a hint of lavender. The woman held him close, her touch careful as she cradled his tiny, paint-streaked body. She was older, her face lined with years of both sorrow and joy. Her eyes, a soft gray, shone with unshed tears as she took in his pitiful state. "Who could do such a thing?" she whispered, her voice thick with sadness. The puppy whimpered, his body sinking into her embrace. He didn't know who she was, but something about her felt different. There was no cruelty in her hands, no sharp laughter in her voice. She carried him home, wrapping him in a warm towel as she set him gently in a basin of water. The warmth seeped into his bones, soothing the raw pain in his skin. Slowly, carefully, she worked to remove the paint, her fingers patient and kind. It took time, each stroke of the cloth revealing patches of his true fur beneath the layers of cruelty. He did not fight her. For the first time in his short life, he allowed himself to trust. When at last the paint was gone, he lay wrapped in a soft blanket, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The woman sat beside him, her hand resting lightly against his side. "You're safe now," she murmured. "No one will ever hurt you again." The puppy believed her, and for the first time in a long while, he closed his eyes, feeling something he had never known before: hope. Margaret had always been an early riser, even in her retirement, long after the school bells had ceased to dictate her days. She found comfort in the quiet moments of the morning. The world was softer then, less hurried, less troubled. She liked to walk the familiar streets of her neighborhood before the rest of the town stirred, taking in the crisp air, the sound of birds calling to one another, the way the sunlight painted everything gold as it climbed over the rooftops. It was a ritual, one that brought her peace. But this morning, something was different. As she turned onto a narrow side street, her gaze fell upon a small, trembling shape near the mouth of an alleyway. At first, she thought it might be a pile of discarded rags, forgotten and abandoned like so many things in this town. But then it moved, just barely, just enough for her to realize it was alive. A puppy. Her breath caught in her throat as she took in the pitiful sight before her. The little creature was covered in streaks of hardened paint, garish blues and reds, cracking along its frail body. Its fur, where it wasn't caked in dried color, was thin and matted. Its ribs were visible beneath its skin, and it shivered uncontrollably, whether from cold, pain, or fear. She couldn't be sure. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret murmured, her heart clenching. She took a cautious step forward. The puppy flinched, shrinking back against the cold brick wall. Its eyes, wide and filled with a heartbreaking mixture of terror and exhaustion, met hers for only a moment before it looked away. as if it had already learned that humans were not to be trusted. Margaret felt something deep within her crack. She had been a teacher for nearly 40 years. And in that time, she had seen her share of children who bore similar expressions, the ones who had been hurt by the very people meant to love them. The ones who had learned to expect cruelty instead of kindness. It was a look she had never been able to ignore. She lowered herself to the ground. Moving slowly, carefully, she spoke in a voice so soft it was barely above a whisper. "It's okay, sweetheart. I won't hurt you." The puppy didn't move, but it didn't try to run either. Margaret saw the way its small chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. It was terrified, but it was also too weak to flee. She hesitated only for a moment before unwrapping the old wool scarf from around her neck. It was a deep shade of burgundy, worn soft from years of use. She held it out, inching closer until she could drape it gently over the puppy's trembling body. "There," she murmured, "that's better, isn't it?" The puppy was still, as if uncertain what to do with the warmth now wrapped around it. Margaret waited, giving it a moment to realize she meant no harm. Then, ever so slowly, she reached out and touched its side. The puppy tensed but did not bite. "That's a good boy," she said softly, though she didn't actually know if it was a boy at all. Carefully, she lifted the small bundle into her arms. The puppy barely weighed anything at all. It let out a weak whimper. But it did not struggle. Margaret held it close to her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat beneath the fabric of her scarf. She turned and started toward home, moving as quickly as she dared. Her house was not far, just a few blocks away. A small, cozy place filled with books and photographs and the quiet echoes of a life well lived. She had once shared it with her husband, but he had passed several years ago. And though the solitude was sometimes heavy, she had learned to find comfort in it. Now, though, she was not alone. Margaret stepped inside, shutting the door gently behind her. She carried the puppy to the kitchen, where the morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the wooden floor. "Let's get you cleaned up, sweetheart," she murmured. She set the puppy on the counter and unwrapped the scarf, wincing at the sight beneath. The paint was thick and dried in places, cracking along the puppy's tiny body like the peeling paint on an old fence. The smell of chemicals clung to its fur. It needed warmth, food, and careful cleaning. Margaret filled a small basin with warm water, testing it with her fingers before dipping a soft cloth into it. "This might feel strange, but I promise it'll help," she said as she began gently wiping away the layers of paint. The puppy whimpered at first, flinching at the sensation, but Margaret worked patiently, her touch as gentle as a whisper. The warm water loosened the hardened streaks, revealing patches of soft, light brown fur beneath. It was slow work, and the puppy trembled beneath her hands. But she could see the exhaustion in its eyes, the way it was too tired to resist. "That's it," she murmured. "You're doing so well." It took time, but eventually, the worst of the paint was gone. Margaret wrapped the puppy in a clean towel, rubbing it dry before cradling it close. She could feel the shivers still racking its tiny frame. "Let's get you something to eat," she said, crossing the kitchen to open a can of plain chicken broth. It was simple, easy on the stomach. She poured a little into a shallow dish and placed it on the floor. The puppy sniffed hesitantly before taking a few tentative licks. Then, as if realizing it was real, it lapped up the broth hungrily, its tiny body leaning forward with new energy. Margaret smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. She watched as the puppy finished every last drop, then curled up on the towel she had laid out. Its eyes drooped, its small body giving in to the pull of sleep. Margaret exhaled slowly, brushing a gentle hand over its head. "You're safe now," she whispered. "No one will hurt you again." The puppy gave a soft sigh, nestling deeper into the warmth. Margaret sat beside it for a long time, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of its breathing. She had not expected to find a new purpose this morning, but as she looked down at the tiny life now resting peacefully in her home, she realized she had, and she would not let him go. Margaret had always believed in patience, in kindness, in the power of time to heal wounds, both visible and unseen. She had spent decades in the classroom, watching children grow, guiding them through their struggles, helping them find their voices when the world seemed too loud, too unkind. Now, in the quiet of her retirement, she found herself drawn into another kind of caregiving, one she had not expected but embraced all the same. The little puppy in her care was fragile, its body exhausted, its spirit even more so. Margaret had spent the morning carefully cleaning him, speaking to him in the same gentle voice she had once used with nervous students on their first day of school. "You're all right, sweetheart," she murmured as she dipped a soft cloth into warm water and ran it carefully over his fur. "You're safe now." The paint had been thick, clinging to his small body like a cruel reminder of what had been done to him. It took time to remove, and even as she worked, Margaret could feel the puppy tremble beneath her touch. But he did not fight. He was too weak to resist, too exhausted to do anything but endure. She took that as a small sign of trust, that, deep down, he knew she meant him no harm. As the paint dissolved, revealing his true coat beneath, Margaret saw the full extent of his thin frame, the way his ribs pressed against his skin. He was young, too young to have already known such cruelty. But there was something in his eyes, something beyond fear, a flicker of resilience, of quiet endurance. "There you are," she whispered as she wiped away the last traces of color. "That's better, isn't it?" The puppy's ears twitched, his small body still trembling. But Margaret swore she saw a hint of something new in his expression. A tiny shift, as if, for the first time, he wasn't entirely certain that the world would only bring him pain. She wrapped him in a clean towel, holding him close to her chest. His heartbeat was still fast, but steadier now. He let out a small sigh, a sound so soft it nearly broke her heart. But Margaret knew that warmth and food alone would not be enough. The chemicals in the paint could still harm him. His fragile body had been through too much, and she could not take any chances. So she bundled him carefully in her arms, securing him in the warmth of her scarf once more, and set out for the veterinarian's office. The walk was slow, cautious. The morning air had grown colder, and Margaret shielded the puppy as best she could from the chill. He did not fight her hold, did not try to escape. If anything, he burrowed closer to her, his small frame pressing into the safety of her embrace. By the time she arrived, the receptionist at the clinic recognized the urgency in her expression and waved her in without hesitation. Dr. Reynolds, a kind-faced man with graying hair and a gentle touch, examined the puppy with quiet concentration. He ran his hands carefully over the small body, checking for injuries, listening to the shallow rhythm of his breath. The paint could have been dangerous, he said finally, his brow furrowed. The chemicals in it, if absorbed, might have caused serious damage. But, he exhaled, offering Margaret a reassuring nod. You got to him in time. He's dehydrated, underfed, and exhausted, but his vitals are stable. He should recover well with the right care. Margaret felt relief flood through her. She hadn't realized just how much she had been holding her breath. How deeply she had feared the worst. "Thank you, doctor," she said softly, brushing her fingers lightly over the puppy's head. Dr. Reynolds gave her a small smile. "He's lucky you found him." Margaret shook her head. "No," she murmured, glancing down at the tiny bundle in her arms. "I think I'm the lucky one." She left the clinic with a list of instructions: hydration, small meals, rest, gentle exercise once he was strong enough. She carried the puppy home with the same careful determination she had walked in with, feeling the slight weight of him settle against her, trusting her a little more with every step. The next few days were quiet, filled with slow, steady progress. Margaret fed him in small portions, watching with relief as his appetite returned. She set up a soft bed near the fireplace. But more often than not, he curled up beside her instead, his tiny body pressed against the warmth of her leg. At first, he remained cautious. He watched her movements with wary eyes, flinching slightly when she reached for him too quickly. Margaret didn't push. She let him come to her in his own time, letting trust grow at its own fragile pace. And then, one evening, something changed. Margaret was sitting in her armchair, a book resting open in her lap, the soft glow of the fire flickering in the dim light of the room. The puppy lay curled at her feet, his small breaths steady, peaceful. Then, without warning, his tiny tail gave a small, hesitant wag. Margaret stilled. She hadn't seen him wag his tail before. Not once, not even a little, but there it was, a tentative, almost uncertain movement, like a question rather than a statement. She smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. "Well, look at that," she murmured. "Is that a happy tail I see?" The puppy blinked up at her. And then, as if emboldened by her voice, his tail wagged again, this time, just a little more freely. Margaret laughed, the sound soft and full of quiet joy. "You're getting there, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're learning." She reached down, brushing her fingers lightly over his head. He didn't flinch this time. Instead, he leaned into the touch, his eyes half closing in contentment. It was a small thing. A simple thing. But to Margaret, it meant everything. Trust. Hope. A future. She didn't know what would come next. Whether she would keep him or find him a home. She didn't know what his life would look like beyond these walls. Beyond this quiet, healing space they had built together. But she did know this. He was no longer just surviving. He was beginning to live. Margaret had never been one to believe in fate. But as she sat in her favorite armchair, watching the little puppy curled up on the soft blanket by the fireplace, she couldn't help but think that some things were meant to be. He had survived against all odds, endured cruelty no creature should ever have to face. And yet here he was, safe, warm, and slowly beginning to trust. She had thought long and hard about what to call him, about what name would suit this tiny fighter. And in the end, it had come to her so naturally that she wondered why she hadn't thought of it sooner. "Lucky," she murmured, reaching down to scratch the little pup's ears. He blinked up at her, his soft brown eyes reflecting the fire's glow. "Because no matter how hard things got, you still found your way to safety. And I think, in some way, I was lucky to find you too." His tail thumped against the blanket. And Margaret smiled. Yes, Lucky was the perfect name. From that day forward, Lucky was no longer just the frightened little stray who had stumbled into her life. He was family. And with each passing day, he began to change. At first, it was subtle, the way he started sleeping a little more soundly. His small body no longer curled so tightly, as if bracing for something bad to happen. The way he began to follow Margaret around the house, keeping her within sight as if reassuring himself that she was still there. The way he no longer flinched when she reached out to touch him. Margaret knew that trust was not something that could be forced. It had to be built, one gentle moment at a time. And so, she was patient. She let Lucky come to her when he was ready. Let him take the lead in this quiet, careful dance of learning to believe in kindness again. She spoke to him constantly, even when she knew he didn't understand her words. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you some breakfast. What do you think of this book? I read it years ago, but I don't remember much. It's a beautiful morning, isn't it? Maybe we'll go for a little walk today." She didn't know if the sound of her voice comforted him, but she liked to think it did. He always seemed to perk up when she spoke, his ears twitching, his head tilting in that curious way puppies had. And then, one day, he wagged his tail, not just hesitantly, not just in response to something uncertain, but fully, happily, without fear. Margaret had nearly burst into tears right then and there. From that moment on, Lucky changed more and more. He started playing, first cautiously, batting at a crumpled piece of paper she had dropped on the floor. Then later, with boundless energy, chasing after an old tennis ball in the backyard. He explored every inch of the house, poking his nose into bookshelves, pawing at the soft folds of the blankets Margaret kept on the couch. He discovered that he liked belly rubs and that Margaret's lap was the perfect place for an afternoon nap. He was still small, still thin, but with each passing week, he grew stronger. His coat, once dull and patchy, became soft and shiny. His once guarded eyes filled with life, with mischief, with joy, and oh, how he made Margaret laugh. She hadn't realized how quiet her life had become until Lucky came barreling into it. She had been content before, happy in her way, but there had been a stillness, a silence she hadn't noticed until it was gone. Now, her home was filled with the sound of tiny paws skittering across the floor, of playful growls as Lucky wrestled with an old slipper, of delighted laughter when he did something particularly silly, like the time he tried to chase his own tail and ended up tumbling into the laundry basket. "You're a little troublemaker, you know that?" she chuckled, lifting him out as he wagged his tail excitedly, clearly unbothered by his tumble. Their morning walks became a favorite part of the day. At first, Lucky had been hesitant to step outside, lingering near Margaret's feet, his body tense, as if expecting something bad to happen. But little by little, he grew braver. He sniffed at the grass, at the fallen leaves, at the wooden fence that lined the sidewalk. He perked up at the sound of birds, his head tilting with fascination. He learned that people passing by weren't all bad, especially the older gentleman down the street who always had a biscuit in his pocket just for Lucky. Margaret watched it all with quiet wonder, marveling at how much he had changed, at how much love could mend what had once been broken. One evening, as she sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Lucky curled up beside her, his head resting on her lap. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange, the air carrying the crisp scent of approaching autumn. Margaret stroked his fur absent-mindedly, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the warmth of his small body against her. "You know," she murmured, "I think you saved me just as much as I saved you." Lucky's tail wagged lazily, and Margaret smiled. She had spent so much of her life caring for others, her students, her family. When retirement had come, she had worried, in some small way, that she would feel adrift, that without the structure of her classroom, she might not know where she fit in the world anymore. But then Lucky had come into her life, and suddenly, there was purpose again. She had something to wake up for, something to love, something to cherish, a new beginning, a second chance. For both of them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the yard, Margaret let out a contented sigh, sipping her tea as Lucky nestled closer. Yes, she thought, gently running her fingers through his fur. Lucky, indeed. The world had a way of moving on, of forgetting the stories that had been written in the cracks of its pavement. In the quiet corners of its streets, people passed by, wrapped up in their own lives, their own troubles, never stopping to wonder about the past of an old woman walking with her dog, or the journey that had led them here. To them, Margaret and Lucky were just another pair, a woman enjoying her golden years, a loyal dog trotting faithfully at her side. No one knew that Lucky had once been abandoned, shivering in an alleyway, his tiny body covered in cruel streaks of paint. No one knew that Margaret had once walked these same streets alone. Her days quiet, her nights filled with memories rather than company. But they knew, and that was enough. Margaret had never imagined how much life could change in a matter of months. She had always thought of herself as content, as someone who had lived well, loved well, and had settled into the peaceful solitude of her later years with grace. But then Lucky had come into her life, and she realized just how much she had been missing. Now, every morning, without fail, she and Lucky walked the same route, the one that led past the alley where she had first found him, past the storefronts where he had once scrounged for scraps, past the places where his past had been written in the dirt and dust of the town. But he did not cower anymore. He did not pull away from the world. He walked with his head high, his tail wagging, his body strong and sure beside hers. And people noticed. At first, it had been small, a few curious glances, a polite nod from a passing stranger. But soon, as the weeks went on, smiles began to greet them wherever they went. The man who owned the bakery would step outside and chuckle as Lucky sniffed at the air, catching the scent of fresh bread. The woman who ran the flower shop always had a kind word, a warm wave as they passed. Children, at first hesitant, soon reached out tiny hands, giggling as Lucky licked their fingers. "He's such a good boy," they would say, and Margaret would smile, nodding. Yes, she would agree, he is. She never told him the whole story. There was no need. Lucky's past did not define him, just as her own did not define her. What mattered was the present. The warmth in his eyes, the joy in his steps, the way he had transformed from a frightened, broken creature into something whole, something free. She often thought about that transformation, about how love had the power to mend even the deepest wounds. Lucky had come into her life needing so much, needing safety, patience, trust, and in giving him those things, she had found something she had not realized she was missing. Companionship, a reason to wake up in the morning with anticipation rather than routine. A presence beside her as she read in the evenings. His soft breathing a steady rhythm against the quiet hum of the house. It had been years since she had felt this kind of connection, this sense of shared belonging. And though Lucky could not speak, though he did not understand the complexities of human emotions, she knew he felt it too. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long golden rays across the town, Margaret and Lucky walked the usual path. The sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The breeze was gentle, the air crisp with the first whispers of autumn. Lucky trotted beside her, his ears perked, his eyes bright, taking in the world as though he had never seen it before. And perhaps, in a way, he hadn't, not like this. Not with the assurance that he was safe, that he was loved. Margaret reached down, running her fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth of him beneath her hand. "We did it, didn't we?" she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We saved each other." Lucky paused, looking up at her, his tail wagging slowly, and in that simple moment, in the quiet understanding that passed between them, Margaret knew that no matter what came next, no matter how many more years they had together, no matter how time moved forward, she would never be alone again. Because love, in the end, had given them both a second chance. And that was the greatest gift of all.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.